the first Marine to set foot on Guadalcanal's black volcanic sand on August 7, 1942, couldn't have imagined he was stepping onto what would become America's first major ground offensive of World War II. Private First Class Robert Jenkins of the 1st Marine Division squinted through the humid dawn air, watching coconut palms sway in the tropical breeze that carried with it the stench of rotting vegetation and something far more ominous. Major General Alexander Archer Vandergrift stood aboard the transport ship Macaulay, studying the intelligence reports one final time. The Japanese had been constructing an airfield on this godforsaken speck of land in the Solomon Islands, and Allied command knew that whoever controlled that airstrip would control the sea lanes to Australia. What they didn't know was that they were about to embark on a campaign that would test every ounce of American resolve and redefine the nature of Pacific warfare. The initial landings proceeded with surprising ease. The 11,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division hit Red Beach with minimal resistance, their landing craft grinding against the coral as they waded through knee-deep water, rifles held high above their heads. The Japanese construction workers and Korean laborers who had been building the airfield fled into the jungle at the first sight of the American Armada, leaving behind half-eaten bowls of rice and still-warm machinery. Colonel Frank Etch, the division intelligence officer, surveyed the abandoned Japanese positions with growing confidence. The enemy had left behind bulldozers, trucks, and enough construction materials to finish the airfield themselves. "Looks like the Japs didn't want to stick around for the party," he remarked to his aide, unaware that 25,000 Japanese troops were already mobilizing from bases across the Pacific, preparing to retake what they called Guadalcanal. By nightfall of the first day, the Marines had secured the unfinished airfield and dubbed it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at the Battle of Midway. The men dug their first foxholes in the coral sand, sharing sea rations and cigarettes while listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the tropical night. Tree frogs chirped incessantly, fruit bats shrieked overhead, and somewhere in the dark jungle, unseen eyes watched the American positions. According to military historian Richard Frank's definitive account Guadalcanal, the definitive account of a landmark battle, the initial success of the landings gave Allied commanders false confidence about the ease of the campaign ahead. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, established his command post near the airfield's eastern perimeter. A veteran of the China Marines and Nicaragua campaigns, Edson possessed the kind of combat instinct that would prove invaluable in the months ahead. As he studied his maps by candlelight, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Japanese withdrawal had been too easy, too complete. The first night passed without incident, but the Marines who managed to sleep did so fitfully. The jungle seemed alive with movement, and every rustling leaf or snapping twig could herald the approach of a Japanese infiltrator with a bayonet and fanatical determination. Dawn brought the realization that they had seized their objective, but holding it would prove to be an entirely different challenge. Unknown to the Americans digging in around Henderson Field, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was already planning Operation Ka, a massive counteroffensive designed to crush the American foothold on Guadalcanal. The stage was set for a 6-month struggle that would determine not just the fate of a small island, but the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. The first indication that Guadalcanal would not be the easy victory Allied commanders had envisioned came at 9 minutes past 1 o'clock on the morning of August 9, 1942. Seaman First Class James Patterson, standing watch aboard the heavy cruiser USS Storia, spotted unusual shadows moving across the dark waters of what would soon be known as Iron Bottom Sound. By the time he could sound the alarm, Japanese naval guns were already tearing his ship apart. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa had achieved complete tactical surprise. His force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer had slipped past Allied reconnaissance aircraft and now moved like phantoms through the narrow waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. The Battle of Savo Island, as it would come to be known, lasted exactly 32 minutes and resulted in one of the most devastating naval defeats in American history. Captain Howard Bode of the USS Chicago watched in horror as the Astoria's forward turrets erupted in flames. Shrapnel from Japanese shells whistled overhead as his own ship took multiple hits. flooding her engine room and setting her superstructure ablaze. The night erupted in a hellish symphony of exploding magazines, screaming metal, and the cries of men trapped below decks in flooding compartments. The heavy cruiser USS Quincy died fighting. Captain Samuel Moore, mortally wounded on his bridge, ordered his guns to fire until the last possible moment. As Japanese searchlights pinned his ship like a butterfly to a board, the Quincy's 8-inch guns roared defiance even as seawater poured through her shattered hull. She rolled over and sank at 2:35 a.m., taking Captain Moore and 370 men with her to the bottom. Aboard the Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra, Captain Frank tried desperately to bring his ship's guns to bear on the Japanese column. A devastating salvo from the heavy cruiser Chokai turned his ship into a floating inferno within minutes. Getting badly wounded, ordered his crew to abandon ship as ammunition began cooking off in her magazines, sending pillars of flame hundreds of feet into the tropical night. The Marines on Guadalcanal could see the battle raging offshore, watching tracer fire arc across the darkness like deadly fireworks. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, destined to become one of the war's most eloquent chroniclers, crouched in his foxhole watching the distant flashes and wondering if the Navy was winning or losing. The answer came with the dawn, when oil slicks and debris began washing ashore on the beaches where they had landed just 2 days earlier. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of the amphibious forces, faced an agonizing decision as reports filtered in from the devastated cruiser force. 4 Allied cruisers lay on the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, and his remaining ships were desperately low on fuel and ammunition. With Mikawa's force still intact and prowling the waters, Turner made the painful choice to withdraw his transport ships, leaving the Marines on Guadalcanal with only 4 days' worth of ammunition and 17 days of food. Colonel Gerald Thomas, Vandegrift's operations officer, watched the last transport disappear over the horizon with a sinking heart. 17,000 Marines were now stranded on a hostile island, facing an enemy that controlled the seas, but Thomas knew it was more desperate than any shoestring operation. The men had taken. They were hanging by a thread. As documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's Official Naval History, The Struggle for Guadalcanal, the Battle of Savo Island demonstrated that the Japanese Navy remained a formidable opponent despite their defeat at Midway. The psychological impact of the naval disaster rippled through the Marine positions. These men had grown up believing in American naval supremacy, yet they had just witnessed 4 Allied cruisers destroyed in half an hour by an enemy force that had approached undetected and departed unharmed. As they redistributed their dwindling supplies and reinforced their perimeter, they began to understand that survival on Guadalcanal would depend entirely on their own rifles, courage, and determination to hold Henderson Field against whatever the enemy might throw at them. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson had earned his nickname Red Mike not for his hair color, but for his reputation as a hard-fighting Marine who never backed down from a scrap. As he studied the jungle-covered ridgeline south of Henderson Field through his binoculars on the morning of September 12, 1942, he sensed that his most severe test was approaching with the tropical darkness. The Japanese had been running what the Marines cynically dubbed the Tokyo Express, fast destroyer runs under cover of darkness that delivered troops and supplies while bombarding American positions. Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki had already tested the Marine defenses at the Tenere River in August, leading his elite regiment in a suicidal frontal assault that left 800 Japanese dead on the beach. Now Major General Kyoto Koguchi was preparing a more sophisticated attack with 4,000 seasoned troops. Intelligence reports, pieced together from captured documents and native scouts, indicated that Kawaguchi planned to strike the southern perimeter of Henderson Field. The ridge that dominated the approach had become the key terrain feature, and Edson's 1st Raider Battalion, reinforced by elements of the 1st Parachute Battalion, held the critical positions along its spine. Private First Class Johnny Rivers of the 1st Raiders spent the afternoon of September 13th digging his foxhole deeper into the Coral Ridge. The oppressive heat made every shovelful of dirt feel like it weighed 50 pounds, and the humidity soaked through his utilities until they clung to his skin like a second layer. Around him, other Marines cleaned weapons, redistributed ammunition, and tried to ignore the growing sounds of enemy movement in the jungle below. The Japanese preliminary bombardment began at sunset, delivered by destroyers that had crept close to shore under cover of a tropical squall. 6-inch shells screamed overhead, exploding among the coconut palms and sending shrapnel whistling through the Marine positions. The bombardment lasted exactly 23 minutes, long enough to shatter nerves and destroy communication lines, but not long enough to eliminate the determined defenders. Kawaguchi's assault began at 9:30 p.m. with probing attacks all along the ridge. Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle like ghosts, their weapons and equipment blackened to prevent reflection, their faces painted with mud and charcoal. They moved with the practiced silence of veteran infantry, but the Marines were ready for them. The first wave struck Edson's left flank, where Company Baker of the 1st Raiders held a narrow section of the ridge. Corporal Mitchell Page, manning a heavy machine gun position, opened fire when the Japanese were 20 yards away, his weapon chattering in short, disciplined bursts that cut down the leading assault troops. Muzzle flashes strobed through the darkness as Marine rifles added their fire to the defensive barrage. Military historian John Hoffman's once a legend. Red Mike Edson of the Marine Raiders provides detailed accounts of the tactical decisions that proved crucial during this engagement. But Kawaguchi had more than enough men to absorb the initial casualties. Wave after wave of Japanese infantry surged up the slopes, screaming "Banzai," and Marines die tonight as they charged into the defensive fire. Some carried long bamboo poles tipped with bayonets. Others wielded samurai swords that glinted in the muzzle flashes. The fighting devolved into a series of desperate hand-to-hand struggles as Japanese soldiers penetrated the Marine lines. Edson moved constantly throughout the night, appearing wherever the fighting was heaviest, rallying his men with his calm presence and tactical expertise. When a gap opened in his center, he personally led a counterattack that drove the Japanese back down the slope. When ammunition ran low, he organized carrying parties to bring forward supplies from Henderson Field. The battle raged until dawn, with the outcome hanging in the balance throughout the long tropical night. By morning, 700 Japanese lay dead on the slopes of what the Marines would forever after call Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge. The Raiders and paratroopers had held their ground, but barely. Some positions had been overrun twice and retaken in savage fighting with bayonets and entrenching tools. As the sun rose over the battlefield, revealing the carnage scattered across the ridge, the surviving Marines understood that they had passed their most critical test. Kawaguchi's defeat marked the end of Japanese hopes for a quick victory on Guadalcanal, but it also demonstrated the terrible cost of holding this strategic island against an enemy willing to die rather than surrender. By October 19, 1942, Guadalcanal had become a fetid hell that tested men's souls as much as their bodies. Major General Roy Geiger, who had replaced the exhausted Alexander Vandergrift as commander of Marine Air Operations, stood in the muddy operations tent at Henderson Field, studying casualty reports that told a story of slow attrition and desperate endurance. The rainy season had arrived with a vengeance, turning the island into a steaming swamp where men rotted from the inside out. Malaria had claimed more Marines than Japanese bullets, and dysentery was so common that it barely warranted comment in unit reports. Corporal Eugene Sledge, recently arrived with reinforcements, described the conditions in letters home that the censors would never allow to be mailed. Foxholes that filled with putrid water, corpses that bloated and burst in the tropical heat, and the constant presence of rats that grew fat on unburied dead. The Japanese had not given up their attempts to retake Henderson Field. Throughout October, the Tokyo Express continued its nightly runs, delivering fresh troops and heavy artillery that made life miserable for the Americans. Colonel Akinosuk Oka commanded Japanese forces on the western side of the perimeter, and his men had proven themselves masters of jungle warfare and night infiltration tactics. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller arrived on Guadalcanal in September with his 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, bringing with him a reputation for aggressive leadership and an absolute refusal to yield ground to any enemy. His men would need every ounce of that fighting spirit in the weeks ahead, as the Japanese prepared their most ambitious offensive yet, a coordinated attack timed to coincide with a major naval battle that would decide control of the surrounding waters. The Japanese plan was elegant in its simplicity. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo would bring his carriers south to engage the American fleet, while Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake launched a massive ground assault with 20,000 troops against Henderson Field. If successful, the operation would eliminate American air power in the Solomons and open the way for a renewed offensive toward Australia. According to James Hornfisher's comprehensive study Neptune's Inferno, the U.S. Navy at Guadalcanal, the coordination between Japanese naval and ground forces represented their most serious attempt to resolve the Guadalcanal stalemate. The ground offensive began on the night of October 23rd with artillery bombardments that exceeded anything the Marines had yet experienced. Japanese 150mm howitzers, dragged through the jungle piece by piece, pounded American positions with methodical precision. The shells arrived with a distinctive whistle that the Marines learned to recognize and fear, followed by explosions that shook the earth and filled the air with flying coral fragments. Puller's battalion held a critical section of the perimeter where intelligence indicated the main Japanese assault would fall. As the bombardment intensified, he moved from foxhole to foxhole, checking on his men and ensuring they were ready for what was coming. His calm presence under fire had already become legendary among the Marines, who took comfort in their colonel's absolute confidence that they would hold their ground. The infantry assault began at midnight, with Japanese soldiers advancing through the rain-soaked jungle in perfect silence until they were within 50 yards of the Marine lines. The attack came in human waves, each one larger than the last, as Hyakutake committed his reserves in a desperate attempt to break through before dawn. Machine gun nests that had been carefully positioned and camouflaged during the daylight hours now became the focal points of savage fighting. Sergeant John Basilone, commanding 2 machine gun sections in Puller Sector, found himself at the center of the storm. As Japanese infantry swarmed his position, he fed ammunition belts into his weapon with mechanical precision, cutting down attackers who came so close he could see their faces in the muzzle flash. When one gun jammed, he cleared it under fire. When another ran out of ammunition, he carried heavy belts forward through a barrage of grenades and rifle fire. The fighting continued for 3 consecutive nights, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Japanese bodies piled up in front of the Marine positions, but fresh troops kept coming, advancing over the corpses of their comrades with the same fanatical determination. The Americans held their ground through sheer willpower and superior firepower, but they paid a terrible price in men and material. When dawn broke on October 26th, the battlefield fell silent except for the moans of wounded men and the buzzing of flies that had already begun to gather around the dead. Hyakutake's offensive had failed, costing him nearly 4,000 casualties while gaining no ground of tactical significance. The Marines had proven once again that they could not be dislodged from their positions, but the cost of victory was becoming almost unbearable. The waters off Guadalcanal had earned their grim nickname through months of naval combat that left dozens of ships resting on the ocean floor. By November 13, 1942, so many vessels lay scattered across the seabed that sailors claimed you could walk from Guadalcanal to Savo Island without getting your feet wet. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan understood the stakes as he prepared to intercept yet another Japanese naval force approaching under cover of darkness. The Japanese were coming in strength this time: battleships Hai and Kirishima, heavy cruiser Nagara, and 11 destroyers under the command of Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe. Their mission was to bombard Henderson Field into rubble, destroying the American aircraft that had made daylight operations impossible for Japanese forces. If they succeeded, Guadalcanal would fall within days. Callahan's force was outnumbered and outgunned: 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers against a battle line that included 2 of the most powerful warships in the Pacific. The heavy cruiser USS San Francisco served as his flagship, her 8-inch guns loaded with armor-piercing shells that would have little effect against battleship armor. Captain Cassin Young, commanding the light cruiser USS Juneau, knew his 6-inch guns would be virtually useless against the approaching giants. The two fleets met in the early hours of November 15th in what would become known as the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. The engagement began at close range, barely 3,000 yards, in darkness so complete that ships identified targets by silhouette and muzzle flash. The USS Atlanta, commanded by Captain Samuel Jenkins, opened fire first, her guns blazing at what her crew believed to be a Japanese destroyer, but was actually the American destroyer USS O'Bannon. The confusion of night combat immediately took its toll. American ships fired on each other, while Japanese vessels slipped through the formation like ghosts. Their crews trained in night fighting techniques that gave them a decisive advantage. The destroyer USS Cushing, leading Callahan's column, took the first Japanese salvo and erupted in flames that illuminated the entire battle area. Admiral Callahan, standing on the bridge of the San Francisco, tried desperately to coordinate his scattered force through radio communications that were jammed by interference and battle damage. A Japanese shell struck the cruiser's bridge, killing Callahan instantly and leaving his force without central command at the most critical moment of the engagement. Captain Young took over tactical control, but the damage had been done. The American formation was in chaos. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's detailed analysis in History of United States Naval Operations in World War II describes this as one of the most confused and brutal naval engagements of the entire war. The battleship High found herself surrounded by American destroyers that attacked like wolves around a wounded bear. The USS Laffey, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William Hank, closed to point-blank range and pumped 5-inch shells into the battleship's superstructure before Japanese return fire cut her in half. The destroyer USS O'Bannon literally scraped paint with High as she passed, her crew throwing empty shell casings at Japanese sailors visible on the battleship's deck. Through the smoke and flame, individual acts of heroism illuminated the darkness. Seaman First Class Leonard Roy manned his gun mount aboard the cruiser Portland even after losing both legs to shell fragments, continuing to load ammunition until he collapsed from blood loss. Gunner's mate Second Class Oscar Peterson stayed at his station aboard the sinking Juno, firing his anti-aircraft guns at Japanese aircraft until the ship went down. The battle lasted 24 minutes and left both fleets devastated. The Americans lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, while the Japanese suffered damage to the battleship High, so severe that she had to be abandoned and scuttled the following day. More importantly, the Japanese bombardment of Henderson Field had been prevented. Abe's force was too badly mauled to carry out its primary mission. As dawn broke over Iron Bottom Sound, the waters were littered with debris and survivors clinging to life rafts and floating wreckage. The heavy cruiser USS Portland, her stern blown off by a torpedo, sailed in circles because her steering was destroyed, her crew fighting fires while trying to rescue men from the water. The light cruiser USS Helena, miraculously undamaged despite being hit by over 100 shell fragments, moved among the wreckage looking for survivors. The First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal proved that American sailors could fight toe-to-toe with the Imperial Japanese Navy and win, despite inferior training in night combat and less advanced equipment. The victory came at a terrible cost. Over 700 American sailors died in those 24 minutes, but it ensured that Henderson Field would continue operating and that the Marines on Guadalcanal would receive the supplies they desperately needed. The legend of Iron Bottom Sound was written in the blood of brave men from both sides who died fighting for control of a narrow strait that would determine the outcome of the entire Pacific War. Their sacrifice ensured that Guadalcanal would remain in American hands, marking the beginning of the end for Japanese expansion in the Pacific. By February 1, 1943, the smell of victory on Guadalcanal was mixed with the stench of death that permeated every corner of the island. Major General Alexander Patch, who had relieved the exhausted Marine commanders in December, stood on the beach at Cape Esperance watching the last Japanese destroyers disappear over the horizon. Operation Ko, the Japanese evacuation, had been completed with typical efficiency, removing over 10,000 troops in a series of high-speed night runs that the Americans were powerless to prevent. The statistics told the story of 6 months that had changed the course of the Pacific War. American casualties totaled over 7,000 killed and wounded, while Japanese losses exceeded 24,000. More importantly, Japan had lost experienced pilots, sailors, and soldiers that could never be replaced, while American industrial capacity was just beginning to reach its wartime peak. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, now wearing the Medal of Honor for his defense of Bloody Ridge, surveyed the battlefield that had tested his Marines beyond all reasonable limits. The ridge where his raiders had held their ground was now covered with a forest of white crosses marking the graves of men who had died far from home in defense of principles they might not have been able to articulate, but had understood in their hearts. The jungle itself bore the scars of the campaign. Artillery had shattered the coconut palms and left craters that filled with stagnant water, breeding mosquitoes that carried malaria and dengue fever. Abandoned Japanese positions dotted the landscape like infected wounds, filled with equipment and personal effects that spoke of hasty retreats and desperate last stands. Corporal Eugene Sledge, one of the few Marines who had survived the entire campaign, reflected on the transformation that Guadalcanal had wrought in himself and his comrades. They had arrived as young men filled with patriotic enthusiasm and romantic notions of combat. They were leaving as hardened veterans who had seen the worst that human nature could produce and had somehow retained their humanity despite the brutality they had witnessed and committed. Historian Richard Frank's exhaustive research in Guadalcanal. The definitive account demonstrates how this campaign marked the turning point where American forces gained the initiative in the Pacific theater. The strategic implications of the Guadalcanal victory extended far beyond the Solomon Islands. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field had forced them into a defensive posture for the remainder of the war. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered by American Marines and soldiers who had proven they could outfight the Emperor's finest troops in jungle warfare that favored the defender. Admiral Chester Nimitz, visiting the island in the aftermath of victory, walked among the memorials and spoke with survivors who bore the invisible wounds of prolonged combat. Many would never fully recover from what they had experienced during those 6 months of shell shock, as it was then known, had claimed victims who might never fire another shot in anger, but whose minds remained trapped in the foxholes and bunkers of Guadalcanal. The technological lessons learned during the campaign would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. The importance of air superiority had been demonstrated repeatedly, as had the value of coordinated amphibious operations and the devastating effectiveness of American industrial production when focused on military objectives. Captain James Conroy, one of the few company commanders to survive the entire campaign, wrote in his final report that Guadalcanal had been won not by superior strategy or tactics, but by the simple refusal of American fighting men to accept defeat. When ammunition ran low, they used bayonets. When communications failed, they relied on individual initiative. When hope seemed lost, they found reserves of courage they had never known they possessed. The native population of Guadalcanal, caught between two powerful armies, had suffered tremendously during the campaign. Villages had been destroyed, families separated, and traditional ways of life disrupted by modern warfare conducted with industrial-age weapons. Coast watchers like Jacob Vuzza, who had risked torture and death to provide intelligence to American forces, represented the kind of courage that transcended nationality and ideology. As the last American units prepared to leave Guadalcanal for new campaigns in the Central Pacific, they left behind more than military equipment and temporary installations. They left part of themselves in the black volcanic soil, in the memories of friends who would never see home again, and in the knowledge that they had participated in something larger than themselves, the defense of freedom against tyranny. The Guadalcanal campaign had tested American resolve and found it unbreakable. From Henderson Field to Iron Bottom Sound, from Bloody Ridge to the Tenor River, ordinary Americans had proven they could match the fanatical determination of their enemies while retaining the values that made their sacrifice meaningful. The victory had come at a terrible cost, but it had demonstrated that democracy could produce warriors as brave and dedicated as any totalitarian regime, and that American industrial might, once unleashed, was capable of achieving the impossible.